Tamu morning show.
Oh! Young and old warriors!
The fort is breached, and the wagons are burning.
Why doesn't the Prime Minister just say the truth and tell indigenous peoples that he doesn't give a about their rights?
Free Leonard Peltier. We want to free Palestine.
It's a good day to be indigenous.
KREZ 1680 AM.
Sangitamu Turtle Island, welcome back to the TRN-KREZ 1680 AM morning show. Today we are celebrating 5 years of the Red Nation podcast by continuing our Best of series by highlighting the year 2021. We start the year off strong, recounting January 6, 2021, when settlers went wild on Capitol Hill. And we bring the year to a close beautifully with Bolivia is Medicine for the World with Vivi Camacho. 2021 was a significant year of the podcast, and once again, it was a tough decision to pick which episodes made it into the final track list. I encourage our listeners to listen to each episode in whole, and you can find them listed on the Red Nation website, or you can simply search for each episode title in your favorite podcast platform. As a part of our ongoing celebration, we are also making sure to create bonus content for our patrons. Every Best of episode has a part 2 that is listed on the Red Media Patreon. Our patrons get exclusive access to the Best of 2021 Part 2, and you can gain access by becoming a patron. You can find the link to our Patreon in our bios. Our Patreon has other exclusive benefits like sticker packs and books and for different tiers of support, and you can become a patron for as little as $2 a month. We don't get huge grants, we don't sell advertisements on our show, and we are truly a base-funded show. So thank you so much to all of our patrons for empowering our work for 5 years and counting. Enjoy the show, comrades.
And it's turning that common sense into a good sense to say, well, actually, we need to build social power and we need organization and discipline.
We need to build the alternative to liberalism.
Right.
And I think I like the way that you said it earlier, Sina, that kind of like get up and go kind of aspect of American kind of political formations. I think that's attached strongly also to this non-ideological anarchism, like the kind we saw at Standing Rock, right? Where people are like, oh, the fucking state is coming in and trying to like go through this indigenous lands. We're going to fucking show up and throw down. And there's like actually a beautiful power and energy to it. Like the Red Nation does actually a lot of non-ideological anarchism, primarily because that's the primary way in which indigenous people have been engaged in resistance, kind of in this more recent historical period. So we support that work 100%, but we are also committed, right, as Nick says, to turning that common sense into good sense, because we know, right, that if we have any hope of providing an alternative to liberalism, we actually have to build that alternative. And like just getting up and going to a place that a struggle that will end at some point it's just not enough. Mm-hmm. And we're just like staring down the barrel of like an epic fucking gun. Like we are in a major epical shift right now. And so like, what are we going to do to like be the bridge, right, to the alternative future? Because ain't nobody who has state power right now is the bridge to that future, or the people who support them. I mean, like, it's a small group of people right now who I think are really seeing the writing on the wall. We're not freaking out about what happened on Wednesday. We're just like preparing, right? We're ready to continue. We're ready to build. But there needs to be a shift in the left. Yeah. There really does. Yeah. People need to be more serious about this shit.
Yeah. And I think, I was talking to an old Aimster, I should say, which is hopefully will be a podcast episode. And we were talking about, he was like, why AIM was successful is that it provided like the American Indian movement, for those of you that don't know. He was like, why it was so successful is that it provided the resources and organizing structure to like actually get things done and to show up and to like defend indigenous people and advance indigenous sovereignty. But it also allowed a space for what he called the lone warriors. And we have a lot of those in Indian country, the people who like are just grassroots people who they're organic intellectuals. They are the products of their situation. They're organically anti-imperialist. They're organically anti-colonial. But that doesn't make them leftists or like developed kind of like revolutionaries. And he's like, that was the beautiful thing about AIM is that we had the capacity to build, these, what he called the lone warriors. and help them and support their work. And there was like mutual trust. And I think that's, something that we've been, that I don't have any definitive answers on that. And we're not trying to just like, reproduce things that happened in the past. But I think there needs to be a lot of humility practice on the left, and a lot of, slack given for people in this moment in time, because people fundamentally know that this shit is wrong.
Yeah. Like many people.
I like the poll that came out by Illuminative. It was like 95% of Indigenous people distrust the government. And I was like, it's only 95%?
And I think a lot of people are seeking that, the plan. People want a plan. People want that kind of organization that will allow us to like continue moving forward. Because, say like after Standing Rock, for example, people were so demoralized, when it ended, and they saw it as an end, which was really unfortunate. And I think like, even if people are, have these anarcho-liberal tendencies, I think, when they're offered that alternative, when they're offered that plan and that way forward, like they're going to be here for it. Yeah, it was just really heartbreaking to see how demoralized people got. And I just remember constantly telling people like there is a path forward. People are imagining it, and like this is something you can be a part of. And so, yeah, I would hate to see that kind of continued demoralization happen, which I think I also saw like after this past summer from some individuals, and it's like getting in the streets is part of it, but it's not the end all be all. And when that energy like gets quelled, or when we experience defeats there, like it's not an end. So like I don't know, I think that people are ready. They're ready to engage in like a long-term struggle.
Yeah.
But we actually have to build like the infrastructure right around that struggle, because all that's on offer right now for folks who are engaged in this like get up and go kind of radical organic politics is insurrection, which we also support deeply. Like we're always participating in these insurrectionary movements that happen, like whether it's the summer or Standing Rock. But then when the insurrection dies down, like all that's on offer are like nonprofits, electoral politics, or just like individualism. So people take to social media, they create like social media platforms, and then they're trying to participate in politics. And then I think people get deeply demoralized because they're profoundly alienated because there's no vehicle. There's no vehicle for like organized large vehicle where they can see that all of this energy that they've put in to like insurrection or into resistance is actually amounting to something palpable. And like not just on an individual scale, but on a fucking societal and structural level. Not just getting like one Native woman into Congress, but getting like land returned.
And then having white people tell us that she's the first Native woman in history to have real power.
Like we don't want those fucking, like, what do they call that? We don't want those crumbs.
Yeah.
People who engage in insurrection, like from this non-ideological, this very organic, like, fuck the state, like, we know what the history of the United States is really about. There's like a genuine, heartfelt energy behind that. And then when they see that it only amounts to this shit, no wonder they're just like, fuck this, man. Like, I'm just going to stay on social media and I'm not going to participate because none of this actually changes anything. And those of us who are actually committed revolutionaries, we need to like stop bitching at each other on Twitter and pretending like we have better politics than each other. And we need to organize an actual alternative for people, working class and poor people who already know what's up, but they have absolutely no avenue to turn to. That's our fucking job. Sorry, I'm mad. I'm mad because the left does this all the time in the United States. There's such arrogance and conceit in the way that we engage in politics. Like total lack of vision.
Just the part where we shamelessly self-promote the Red Deal.
Yeah, and this is where we encourage people to join organizations and to actually, like not make fun of, actual protest movements that are trying to like, let's say like get Medicare for all.
Yeah.
Even though we may disagree on tactics and strategy, nonetheless, like there are things that we can win. There are campaigns that could be won. We're not just like demanding like people do impossible things or maximalist politics that only if these meet our XYZ standards of whatever. The fact of the matter is, like, if you're not struggling, you're not doing enough. and
Straight
there are
up.
people that are struggling, and they're, that are like, trying to form real alternatives to this particular moment in time. And it begins by joining an organization. It begins by, by practicing discipline and understanding that we are not where we should be. The right, if January 6th is any indication, the right is far ahead of us.
Yeah.
They've outpaced us by decades. And part of it has to do with state repression. Like, there is that structural element.
Yeah, they have the monopoly of the state on their side.
But we have the choice, and we have the agency as people on the left, as revolutionaries, to engage or not engage in the failed politics of the past. And I feel like there's this moment in time where people are just done with the kind of dogmatic, ideological kind of movements that have, or not really movements, but online culture that hasn't really amounted to much.
Nope.
And I love Twitter. I love the back and forth on it, but it's also, I don't live on Twitter. The only reason I've been more active on Twitter is because I'm stuck at home, which is sad. And so I think that that's the point. Like, is that we're actually like coming out of this. There's an urgency among people that I find very hopeful. And
absolutely,
we're seeing the people that, that the electoral products that are electoral politics and the elected officials who are a product of these movements operate in ways that are completely unaccountable to them. And that is going to fundamentally like blow up in people's faces and on, like in 2021, it's going to be, 2021 is going to be a very difficult year. But it's also going to be a very beautiful year, I think, if this stuff continues. And so I think that we are in a good position as long as we, I think I want to encourage other people to either join the Red Nation or join some kind of organization. Join the Red Nation if you're an Indigenous person really looking for an outlet and a way to organize. And I often don't pitch this very much, but we are hundreds, of people and of Indigenous people who are ready to fight and who are committed to actually changing this world and helping our relatives.
I wrote the conclusion to the Red Deal. It's coming out in April with Red. Our first book with an imprint we started. We actually haven't talked about this much either. We'll roll all of this shit out as the spring continues. But like the last line of the book is, "We are waiting for you." Like, we're ready and we're waiting for you. And that's really the truth. That's not a condescending thing. We're really, the Red Nation is a group of Indigenous revolutionaries who really are ready to do what we need to do, right? To build that bridge to the future so our people can live a beautiful and abundant life. And we really are waiting for you to join us because, we need to grow the ranks of this movement that we're trying to build. And I would just really want to encourage people listening to let go of like these bad habits, these failed habits, of like radicals and of the left and, our skepticism about what it means to organize, or our skepticism about socialism even, just like really deep anti-communism that's built into the fabric of American identity that all of us participate in. It's very difficult to overcome because it's hegemonic, but we're not actually asking you to be a socialist. We're just asking you to believe in organized struggle and to believe in actual struggle, right? Not just discourse, but that you have to actually struggle with other people, really different people who are very different from you, actually. You have to struggle with them in order to make any kind of change, and definitely in order to make the kind of change that we desperately need if we're going to have a future as a species, let alone as like individuals or as nations or our families. So I encourage everyone to like take a leap of faith to do like the kind of large scale political struggle that I'm almost 40, that I have never actually participated in my entire life. It's very daunting. It makes me kind of nervous, but nevertheless, I'm like 110% fucking ready to do it with thousands of other people.
It's called the Savage Constitution, and looking at the drafting of the U.S. Constitution, because it's often argued, incorrectly, that the U.S. Constitution is modeled after the Iroquois Confederacy. But in fact, the U.S. Constitution doesn't really talk about Indigenous peoples that much. But it was, in the debates, people like Alexander Hamilton made a very strong case for a central, a strong central government and army. There's a piece that we quote, and the author theorizes this kind of concept of the military financial nexus of the founding of the United States. But it was basically an idea of perpetual warfare, creating a strong central government that was always under constant threat by not just other competing European powers in North America, but indigenous people themselves. And this was the idea of the frontier that was spelled out very clearly in the Declaration of Independence. Merciless Indian savages whose only known rule of warfare is like basically killing civilians, or they don't have one. And therefore, like, everyone is a target, not just enemy combatants, but non-combatants. And I've written elsewhere and argued that the Declaration of Independence of the United States is actually a counterinsurgency doctrine that later informs the way that it deals with indigenous people and, other so-called like stateless enemies. And we also did an episode with Charisse Burden-Stelly, historian, where we read the trilogy, the settler colonialism trilogy, or the counter-revolution trilogy, where Gerald Horne traces, the origins of the United States, not only in chattel slavery and the counter-revolution of, 1776 to maintain the institution of plantation slavery specifically, but also going back to, the deep origins of the settler colonial project as fundamentally a racial and white supremacist project meant to not only subjugate African people, but indigenous people as well, and how those two kind of histories are intertwined with the very fabric of the United States itself and how it projects itself. And, it's funny you talk about Texas. It's like Texas is like, even today, we had the Supreme Court, refusing to look at the Texas abortion ban. To this day, Texas is driving, it's a laboratory, it's a legal laboratory for eroding indigenous rights. There's, Texas, appeals court is trying to strike down the Indian Child Welfare Act. And they've been, very militant in doing that. But I just wanted to add those comments because you're bringing up so many different threads that I think are incorporated in a lot of the things we've covered in this podcast. Jen, did you have a question?
Can I say something first, to continue to rag on Texas? So, the very beginning of Texas too, there are a bunch of undocumented migrants, right? Or they had gotten some permission from the Spaniards and the Mexican government. So they begin as this quasi-legal, illegal settlement that then, becomes what it is today, right? But it's this the warfare that these settlers waged against the Kiowas and the Comanches. A lot of these volunteer militias that then fought against Mexico in the Mexican-American War, they're seasoned settler warriors, right? And they're the ones who then will commit all sorts of what would now be referred to as war crimes. And so the U.S. Army was divided between the volunteer militias and the U.S. Army, right? And the U.S. Army was they would only include the language they would use, the dregs of society, right? Men who needed to be reformed or migrants who had just come over from Europe. Many of them didn't even have citizenship yet. But these volunteer militias were frontier fighters. And then, so they're the ones who created Texas, Anglo-Texas, and then they're sent into Mexico. And unsurprisingly, they're the ones who waged the worst violations against civilian populations in Mexico. Anyway, that's the No Country for Old Men. That's that. I think Greg Grandin talks about it in his book, The End of the Myth. I think Texas occupies this really central location in this frontier imaginary, and the type of violence that drives that never-ending pursuit for the frontier, I think. Sorry, Jen.
No, thank you for that, because now I have a follow-up question. We're seeing right now popping back up again self-proclaimed militias, right? The Proud Boys, the Three Percenters. We saw the whole take over of the Capitol on January 6th. And it seems really clear to me that these people know their history and they know their origins. And so would you argue that some of these contemporary militias we're seeing popping up, have their roots in these very early militias tasked with, Indian killing and, capturing enslaved African people?
Yeah, I think just folks working on genealogies of the police, right? I think you could make a strong case to connect the dots, right? And connect the current militias to their historical antecedents, right? Like they're in terms of like their logics, in terms of how they imagine the U.S., in terms of how they imagine what they think they're doing in protecting the U.S. and protecting this form of American exceptionalism. I think the current militias that are invaded state houses, right, or even the stuff that happened on January 6th. Like I think there's 2 0 points for them. One, and this is written about by like folks like historians like Catherine Ballou. Like they're really, you could draw a straight line from then to like these hardcore right-wing anti-communist, sometimes military veterans from Vietnam, who then are fighting as mercenaries or private citizens against the revolutionary movements that break out in Central America in the 1970s and 80s, right? So you have these guys who are like, who have some sort of military experience from Vietnam, who become very disillusioned by what happened in Vietnam. So a small core of them will hire themselves out to some of these death squad regimes in Central America. And then they come back to the US in the 80s, and they're the ones waging like this war against undocumented migrants. Because in the 80s, when you start to see an explosion in public discourse about, it begins in the 70s, but it really takes off in the 80s, like undocumented migrants are flooding the US. There's an LA Times headline from like the late 70s where it's like, illegals are setting up a beachfront for the third world in the US, like that kind of language. So these guys come back, they're still very anti-communist. Some of them have like horrific military experience, counter-revolutionary experience, fighting in places like Nicaragua and Salvador. But their new targets now are undocumented migrants. From there, they spread off, and they're the ones who create the movements in the early 2000s, like the Minutemen in Arizona, who are anti-migrant, but some of these Vietnam War vets are now joined by more recent war vets from like the war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan. And their imaginary is both frontier, both anti-communist. And then because it's the war on terror, they'll say things like Arizona is our new Gaza. So it brings in like the war on terror as it was practiced and waged in the Middle East. And they'll say things like when they're walking the desert in 2005, 2006, they'll say, well, we found prayer rugs, right? Or, I think I mentioned in the article that they claim that Arabic migrants were changing their last names to Latinx last names as a way because they basically look the same, right? And that will allow them to cross into the border and then infiltrate, right? I think that's one really important source for these militias, right? This Cold War, hard right anti-communism that's defined against revolutionary movements in Latin America that then gets brought back to the border. And then once they're at the border, they mix with the KKK, they mix with more domestic anti-migrant, racist, white supremacist movements. And it creates, I think, what we have today, even if they're like really good at kind of, not revealing the sources of their imaginaries. I mean, in Portland, the other Latin American connection to these groups, like in Portland, when the fighting began between like anti-fascist groups and some of these like it wasn't the Proud Boys, like Patriot Prayer and then the Proud Boys. Like there was a couple of guys in those groups who wore shirts that said like Pinochet did nothing wrong, right? Pinochet being the military general who became dictator in Chile, who overthrew Salvador Allende in 73 and then was the leader of the dictatorship until the late 80s and did a lot of atrocities in Chile. So they're wearing shirts that said Pinochet did nothing wrong, or they had a shirt that said helicopter rides for communists for free or something like that, right? Which is, again, a reference to Latin American, like hard right-wing military dictatorships who did use helicopters and planes to dump dissidents and revolutionaries out into the South Atlantic or Pacific Ocean. And so there's a very direct, I think, Latin American 0 point to some of these militias, but they're also carrying these longer legacies of imagining themselves as these like frontier Minutemen that are helping. They're part of the 3% who actually rose up against the British. It's that same settler mentality.
You bring up some interesting points. And, Tom Cotton was on like Fox News the other night commenting on the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. And he made this comment where it's like, it's like the reflexive comment of the right. Like they only have the border, like the border is always porous. They've Texas and Arizona have declared states of emergency, and you have billionaires funding, the South Dakota National Guard to go down to the U.S.-Mexico border. That's the state I'm from originally, and Kristi Noem has kind of pioneered that tactic of soliciting donations from billionaires to deploy the state National Guard. But he was making this comment about like kind of the tainted legacy of U.S. defeat in Afghanistan, but also suggesting Vietnam. And he was saying that the Afghan allies in the U.S. war on terror have a harder time entering the country than terrorists on the southern border. And so even in the withdrawal, he's like, but we have to refocus not only on China but also on the U.S. Mexico border, and Biden is part of this problem. And it got me thinking about how pertinent the piece that you wrote, the American Maginot Line, is in terms of it's always about every time there's a crisis. In this case, it's the defeat of U.S. occupying forces in Afghanistan, and that is like a totally foreign issue, right? But then it becomes a domestic issue because we haven't secured our borders enough. So we're losing two wars. We're losing the U.S.-Mexico border war and the Afghan war. But then, the more militarized, as you point out in the piece, the more militarized the border becomes, the more out of control it becomes as well. So it's this like fulfilling kind of circular logic where it's like there is never enough that one can do because it's always in crisis. And the more that one does, the more it becomes, imperiled and embroiled in that particular crisis.
Yeah, it's politically productive, right? I think that's what it does. The fallback is always on the U.S.-Mexico border, at least since like the Cold War. And it's a bipartisan project as well. So like when the U.S. lost Vietnam, you have a pivot where in the context of undocumented migration and drugs coming into the U.S., they pivoted to the border, and very quickly they even use the same technology from Vietnam. They sent it to the border, right? Which is I mentioned in the piece, and then in the second part that I'm working on, using electronic sensors that they had used in Vietnam, or using like sniper technology in Vietnam, and then giving it to border patrol agents, pinche migra agents. Like it's a very like literal physical transporting of equipment, technology, and ideas from Vietnam to the U.S.-Mexico border. Because as we all know, right, like the U.S. doesn't lose. It doesn't lose. We can't. It's not possible. It's like against the story, right? So how do you then reframe Vietnam, and then how do you reframe Afghanistan now? And one of the ways is to like pivot back to the border. And it's a thoroughly bipartisan project, right? Like I think that in the context of today, the Republicans, we're seeing a radicalization of the right, which I think is needs to be followed. It's scary. And it's a real threat. But this whole securing the border thing, or framing the issue of the border through the lens of national security, it's a wholly bipartisan project, right? There's a reason why we called Obama the deporter in chief.
The introduction of the sex trade, of prostitution, was the basis of producing capitalism on Turtle Island. And that the sex trade, I know, especially in my region here in New Mexico, has shaped identities. It has shaped even our relationships to land. And it continues to. And people are familiar with the trafficking that takes place around man camps, that is perpetuated by gas and oil extraction, other mineral extraction, that's perpetuated by casinos, right? And these other centers of capital. So I was just wondering if you all wanted to talk a little bit about maybe how this like issue manifests in your particular regions, or how you have seen it historically manifest in the places where you are located.
It's really obvious that the chain of exploitation from colonization remains unbroken in Hawaii, even with empirical data. So, for example, we did a study of interviews with people who had been identified as meeting the federal and state criteria for sex trafficking. And in that study, the majority were Native Hawaiian, meaning over 60% actually in that one. And almost half of them had a mom or a grandmother who had also been in the sex trade, and so on. So there is evidence of this intergenerational exploitation specifically among Native women in Hawaii. Because historically, abduction, trafficking, picture brides were practices to meet the demand of, this mass migration to erase and replace indigenous people here. And most of those laborers for the plantation here were men. And so it created a need to meet that demand. And traditionally here, and what appears to be continuing from everything that we see with service providers and frontliners and survivors, is that that's still continuing today.
Yeah. And, to sort of build off of that here in California, I hope folks have read An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. And, when I was studying that book, I was sort of surprised to come across a breakdown that she does here in Northern California about how prostitution was forcefully introduced into this land. And, she talks about how, there were, several nations in Northern California that experienced, mass death, right? Both from armed conflicts with the Spanish, as well as from disease, as well as, forceful relocation to missions. And towards the second half of the 19th century, among those same people, U.S. armed forces killed over 4,000, disease killed another 6,000, and up until 1867, U.S. settlers kidnapped over 4,000 Native children from those very nations in California. And she writes that the disruption of those indigenous social structures, along with the dire economic situation that was forced upon them, ended up literally forcing women into prostitution in and around goldfield camps, which she cites as completely destroying the vestiges of indigenous family life that remained in societies that were largely matriarchal. And so we see how when prostitution, it's sort of inextricably linked with militarism and colonization. And it destroys the values of, sort of indigenous society that were lost when it was forced upon them. And I think it also says something about the recruitment strategy of the sex trade, which today in what we call the US is completely ignored, right? Because we see it just as an individual choice based on autonomy like any other job. But we're ignoring the fact that since, the sex trade has existed, it has always recruited its army of labor through forced displacement, forced migration, mass murder, abduction. And today, what we see is recruiting from those who have been pushed to the edges of society into dire poverty through, economic and social oppression. And I think it's so important to, be able to trace that from when, this land was forcefully taken up until now, and see that there is a common thread in how they recruit their army of labor.
Yeah, that's such a good point, that it didn't just prostitution as a system didn't arise organically and without tremendous resistance, because like in Hawaii, and I'm not in the best position to tell this story, but two cultural historians and writers, Noelani Arista and Adam Manalo Camp, have written about this, and I would suggest them strongly. The idea that land and women, the idea of land and women as commodities was shocking and repugnant. And, there was this entitlement when male European and then American sailors and soldiers began coming to the islands, expecting access to Native women. And when that wasn't granted, you see basically insurrection. So in 1825, the chiefs of Hawaii instituted a ban on prostitution because what would be the sex trafficking of girls had gotten so out of hand. And it didn't last, because what happened is that the sailors attacked the homes and set them on fire of who they thought was supporting this ban. So chiefs and also missionaries at that time. And so it was later rescinded because they were just so incensed that they were visiting and they were not being given access to Native women. And so it was met with violence. So that history is here. It's in other places across the Pacific and around the world, that this system did not just, appear because men need sex and it's just a normal feature of human societies.
Absolutely. Thank you both for those very eloquent analyses. That was amazing. Yeah, and I mean, so I wanted to kind of move into a little bit of myth busting, right? Because like you mentioned, Esperanza, people think that these are autonomous decisions, and people, when we put forth these critiques of the sex trade rooted in how they manifested historically, people might accuse us of being like swerfs or whatever, or not supporting sex workers, which is, absolutely ridiculous. And so, when people say things like sex work is work, right? What is the history of that term, of that famous quote that we see, being shared constantly on infographics?
What I'll say on this is that, you could trace the rise in popularity of the term sex work is work to Carol Lee, who is a sort of neoliberal feminist, but also to some of the first organizations which were founded by pimps, such as Douglas Fox, who posed as what they would call themselves sex workers, but they were not. They were actual pimps, right? And who sort of popularized this. And I think that, a realization I was having today is that as somebody who organizes workers, I've specifically organized restaurant workers, we're always fighting the, National Restaurant Association, what we call the other NRA, because as an industry association, their job is to cover up the exploitation in the industry, to justify and make excuses for it, and to protect and expand the industry. And what I realized is that a lot of the organizations, if not all of them, that are pushing this line, that sex work is work, period, there's nothing more to the discussion, act as an industry association that fight to protect and expand the industry at the expense of those who are exploited by it. So, part of what I've tried to popularize with my writing or to get across to people is that whether or not something fits a general colloquial definition of work is not important. Plenty of things fit the definition of work. Slave labor fits the definition of work. Child labor fits the definition of work. Plenty of things that we could do for money fit the definition of work. But that should not be the litmus test by which we decide whether or not we allow an industry to continue to exist and expand, especially whether or not we want to codify that industry into law. So my sort of response to sex work is work is that, one, it flattens distinctions between prostitution and other forms of wage labor. So, for example, you often hear that, there's no sort of added risk in prostitution. It's just like any other job. Well, if you accept that capitalism is an economic system built off of severe inequality, then you should also accept that industries themselves are going to be, unequal themselves. Some are going to be more dangerous and exploitative than others. It also, ignores the fact that each kind of work comes with a different risk. So if I'm a line cook and I am constantly deep frying French fries, working around a hot stove, hot oil, hot, pans and plates, there's a high likelihood that I'm going to get burned. If I'm in prostitution, there's a high likelihood that by the very nature of what's happening, I am going to experience rape, sexual assault, beating, robbery. And this is proven true because this violence has never been reformed out at any time throughout history or in any legal context that it's existed in. The second thing I would say about that phrase is that, in attempting to assert personal agency to withstand that violence, it dismisses the army of labor who make up the majority of the sex trade, and who were actually coerced into it because of social and economic forces. And it sort of justifies that coercion by saying, well, we have to choose any job, right? We all have to make a choice. But the reality is that as workers, we have nothing to sell but our labor power, right? We don't have inheritances, assets, etc. But those of us who are blocked from selling our labor power in the formal economy due to racism, transphobia, or just the nature of capitalism requiring a reserve army of unemployed workers, we have to find other ways to survive. And in a society that sexualizes, objectifies, and fetishizes trans women, indigenous women, Black women, etc.
It's like silly commentary, but it's like free Palestine nonetheless. Like I remember it was like, give me like 4 lemon pepper wings, 2 backwoods, like just naming all these like silly random things, and it's like, send me to Palestine, we'll have it free in 2 hours. So people out there are getting it, and I honestly, what I credit it to is just like grassroots movements happening everywhere, and those movements connecting with, Palestinian movements. Like I really applaud like the American Palestinian organizations that are here in the United States who are building those bridges. Like when I went to Palestine, they invited members of Red Nation, including me, and it was with the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights and Eyewitness Palestine. And there was other people doing political work who were there, who were all we're all people of color. We were all doing various works throughout the United States. Just what we do. Like we had a woman from Tohono O'odham who was doing work. We had people who were doing work in DC, just like all various like spectrums of like of the left, and like we were all out there. And I think that endless work of just like Sekane, like poor thing, just like trying to like beg people to understand, it's actually working. Like it worked exactly. And then just that in combination with like Standing Rock and Black Lives Matter, like it's really just coming together.
Yeah, I actually, you explaining it that way, Justine, because I was still a little bit, like I hadn't quite taken the time in my mind to really to historicize and to think about like what exactly has happened in the movement between the last uprising and this uprising that has really changed people's response in Turtle Island to the liberation of Palestine. And I think you actually just explained it really beautifully. I don't remember, this was like several years ago now, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, a friend and a colleague of ours who did work for the Adalah Justice Project, which is another really important Palestinian rights organization. I think it's based here in the U.S., but they also have an office in Palestine. She was entering the West Bank from Jordan, and like many people, like Palestinians certainly, Arabs who try to enter the West Bank or Palestine or even Israel, or people who are there engaged in solidarity work are often interrogated, right? They're interrogated by the IDF before they're allowed to enter, or they don't allow them to enter and they turn them away. But she was being interrogated at the border, trying to enter the West Bank. And one of the IDF soldier who was interrogating her, one of the questions they asked was, so this, what did they say? They're like, so this intersectionality thing, what is that? And the question was framed in a way that it was like threatening, right? The intersectionality was this thing that was already being perceived by the Israeli government as an interrogation question, first of all, right? But that I think that what was being noticed, right, by the occupying government at that time was that there was an increasing kind of coming together and a coalition around various liberation struggles historically, whether it was Palestine or the Black liberation struggle or the Indigenous liberation struggle. This was around the time that Standing Rock was happening, by the way, that I think that this person, our friend, tried to come back into the West Bank. She'd been there many times. And so I think what the Israeli government was noticing even several years ago was the coalescing, right, of forces on the broader left, like even liberals in some ways, like the progressive left around Palestine, and that the liberation of Palestine was being increasingly seen as a touchstone struggle, like within the larger struggle for liberation across lots of different communities globally. And so, fast forward 4 or 5 years, and here we are now, as you said, Justine, it's like the coming together, like you were talking about how on your delegation, that there were people from all different, the whole spectrum of the movement going to Palestine, and people from the spectrum of the movement, not just in the US and Canada, but globally, have been on these delegations to Palestine for a very long time, for years, right? And so we've all gone to Palestine. We're all educated about the issue. We're all educated about settler colonialism. We're all educated about decolonization. We know the history of liberation struggles in lots of different parts of the world. And so we're increasingly internationalist, I would say, transnational, and very much solidarity with other struggles has, at least since the Red Nation was created in 2014, really been at the center of how we envision, right, Indigenous liberation. And so something that I learned from Palestine that I think we're now seeing happening around other people, non-Palestinians in the movement, coming together and uniting around Palestinian liberation, is that I think historically the struggle for Palestinian liberation has taught me and everyone that you cannot achieve self-determination without international solidarity. And they've done such an incredible job under the most horrific, violent conditions of repression and occupation to be able to still build international solidarity. And I think today we're actually really seeing the effect of that, to the point where Zoomers on TikTok are well, if Black Lives Matter is saying we should support Palestine, then I trust that this is an issue that I should just support like that. And so it's yes, free Palestine with a side of fries, or something like that. And that's really amazing. It means international solidarity works. It doesn't always have to be a militant uprising. There are things you can do between more intense revolutions, right, to build that solidarity so that it does create the conditions for something to change when an uprising does happen. And so I think we're maybe seeing that materializing right now. And that right there, that is what gives me true materially grounded revolutionary hope. Because it's that works. That kind of stuff works. And I want us to do more of that around all kinds of issues and not just Palestine.
Yeah, you said it, because that's exactly what I think about, the internationalism, in all of this. It's what I was pretty yoded on when I got back from Palestine, because, one of the things that, keeps coming back to me is, what if our leaders would just, support Palestine? If they would just offer, the most, smallest, form of solidarity, even if it's just, a BDS campaign, for reservations and councils and stuff, that would sincerely make I don't know, I don't like to frame it like this, because I have I'm a little salty towards male councilmen, but but it would put us on the map as sovereign nations, instead of just these poor, sad Indigenous people who got genocided and and are living in the post-apocalyptic destruction of their lands, and just I don't know, just if our leaders could just like do something so simple by expressing their solidarity with other indigenous people, like I think that would be like the key to help all indigenous people like get through it. But one thing like I know that I told Jan when I came back was like I was expressing like how angry I was like that our leaders aren't doing this and that they would rather like, you know, do whack shit like oppress women or wait until like here in the Pueblos, like we were the last ones to sign on to the no dapple solidarity. Like we were like all the tribes across like Turtle Island were like, we expressed our solidarity. Like everybody was putting out these statements, and like the All Pueblo Governors Council was just like at the very end, but they did it. You know, like what do we gotta do to like create that, like not just like an intertribal solidarity, but like an international solidarity with these men? I don't know. I just I think one of the contributing reasons to why I was so salty, I guess, like towards male leadership specifically when I got back from Pal, was that in Palestine, for the first time in my life, like I saw men act like humans to each other, like they were like with the utmost respect to me and to each other. Like I remember our guide, and like he saw one of his comrades from like back in the day, they're OG communists, and like they like ran up to each other, they hugged and kissed each other, and like you just like saw that like camaraderie and like love for one another. And they had that same like love and camaraderie for me. And I don't know, that was like one of the reasons why like I went down thinking like that. But yeah, envisioning like international relationships on like a Pueblo Council level is something I've definitely been like thinking about a lot since I went to Palestine.
Yeah, I hear you, Justine. I would love to see solidarity on that level. And I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but whatever. I don't care. They just aren't educated enough to know what's going on over there. And, you know, the All Pueblo Council governors won't comment because they don't know, they don't understand the situation. And there's also so many roadblocks to expressing solidarity with Palestine that I can imagine. You know, they just don't really have the guts to come right out and like with the no dapple. I mean, they probably looked around the room and went, damn, everyone else is wearing black. Why aren't we wearing black? We better go change and put black on. And that's kind of like what happened with the no dapple. And then you look at the Navajo Nation, and they're expressing solidarity with the Israelis. Because I mean, I don't want to say not all Navajo, not all Dene people.
Navajos.
The leadership, the president, who I will just point out is a man, and the vice president, who just is another man. And
lie.
So they have expressed solidarity with Israel because it's a complete clusterfuffle, because they're saying, well, you know, these Jews are going back to Israel. That's their traditional homeland, and the Palestinians, you need to be removed to make room for the Jewish people. But they're looking at it in a completely whack historical perspective, because that's not actually the truth on the ground. And the truth on the ground is the Palestinians were there, the Palestinians have been there, and it's the exact opposite. They are the indigenous people, and most of the Jewish people who are kicking the Palestinians out of their homes, especially in Sheikh Jarrah, a great number of them are actually flippin' Americans.
Yeah.
Who they're not Sabra, they have moved to Israel to colonize. They didn't get enough colonization in this country, so they had to go and colonize again. This is like their, part two. So they're going and kicking Palestinians out of their homes so that they can have their rightful place in what they consider to be Israel, which is actually Palestine 48. So, the you don't have to be brilliant to know what's going on in Palestine, but you do have to be a little bit aware. And sadly, a lot of our leaders don't have that level of awareness, and many of them just don't care.
Well, and in Navajo and in Pueblo communities, it happens in different ways, but the church is incredibly influential in politics and the way that sovereignty and self-determination are both imagined and practiced by this club of men, right, who lead our nations and our pueblos. And so for pueblos, it's mostly the Catholic Church, right? And for Navajo Nation, it's a lot of these kind of more recent Protestant sects, different types of Protestant sects, often fundamentalist.
A prolific scholar, inspiring educator, lucid poet, and unapologetic orator, Haunani-Kay Trask set the standard for Kanaka Maoli as a widely cherished indigenous nationalist leader of the modern Hawaiian sovereignty movement. A me'e, koa, and manawahine of the Lahui Hawaii. The Lahui, our collective people and nation with its diverse communities, are freer today because of Haunani-Kay. Because of, as she described, her slyly reproductive ideas, activism, prose, advocacy, solidarity, and art, we are that much closer to freedom, to decolonization, to liberation, and to the revolution. Into our light I will go forever. Into our seaweed, clouds, and salt-warm seabirds. Into our wind-swept, ehukai, burnt sands gleaming. Into our sanctuaries of hushed bamboo, awash in amber. Into the passion of our parted ko'olau, luminous vulva. Into Kane's pendulous breadfruit, resinous with semen. Descended from Pi'ilani of Maui and Kaku Makaliwa of Kauai, Haunani-Kay Trask was born on October 3rd, 1949, on Ohlone lands in the territory of Ramaytush, in what is now called San Francisco. One of 5 children to Haunani and Bernard Trask, she and her ohana returned to Hawaii and resided in the district of Ko'olaupoko on Oahu. Haunani-Kay graduated from the Kamehameha schools in 1967, then attended the University of Chicago, where she supported and learned from the Black Panther Party. Exhausted by the fear and violence there, she wrote in the context of the police killing of Fred Hampton, Haunani-Kay transferred to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she got involved in student protest of the Vietnam War. On the continent, she trained in class and the streets. Trask earned a BA in 1972 and later her master's degree in 1975 and PhD in 1981. That same year, based on her dissertation in political science, she published her book, Eros and Power, The Promise of Feminist Theory. Into our wetlands of He'eia, bubbling black mud. Into our spangled blue-leafed taro, flooded with vai. Into Waiahole, chattering with rains and silvered fish. Into our shallows of Kualoa, translucent akua. Into the hum of reef-ringed ka'ava, pungent with limu. Haunani-Kay returned home in 1977 and committed herself to the modern Hawaiian sovereignty movement. Although her ohana was connected in the state of Hawaii's Democratic Party, she turned away from settler state politics and instead organized with Kanaka Maoli on the ground, reviving and protecting Aina in Hawaii, from Koho'olave to Mokauea and He'eia. She also fought against nuclear militarization, sexual violence, tourism, and white supremacy. Throughout the 80s, Dr. Trask was a professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and established the Kamakaku Okalani Center for Hawaiian Studies, serving as its first director. In 1987, she and her sister, Mililani Trask, founded Kalahui Hawaii as a preeminent Hawaiian sovereignty organization to promote self-determination for Native Hawaiians. Both Kamakaku Okalani and Kalahui Hawaii continue to thrive today, largely because of the work of Dr. Trask's comrades and former students. Into our corals of far Kahana, sea cave of Hina, into our chambered springs of Punalu'u, ginger misting, into the songs of lost Laie, cool, light haunting, into murmuring Malai Kahana, plumed sands chanting, into the sheen of flickering Halai'iwa, pearled with salt. Dr. Trask published her magnum opus, From a Native Daughter, Colonialism and Sovereignty in Hawaii, shortly after leading one of the largest Hawaiian sovereignty demonstrations in modern Hawaiian history. On January 17, 1993, to commemorate the 100 years of illegal U.S. occupation in Hawaii. In later years, she became a viral sensation for her speech then, where she proclaimed, "We are not American. We will die as Hawaiians. We will never be Americans." Although many know her for this striking speech, Haunani-Kay was also skilled with written word. She published 2 books of poetry, Light in the Crevice Never Seen and Night is a Sharkskin Drum. Dr. Trask transformed an entire generation of Kanaka Maoli with words, speeches, ideas, and political action. Although we never met, she changed my life forever. I know this is true for me, as well as other Kanaka Maoli. Haunani-Kay Trask passed on July 3rd, 2021, and joined the Aumakua. The poem that I've woven in here is Into Our Light I Will Forever Go by Kumu Trask. I chose to include it and end this tribute in such a way because, like her former student, Dr. Noelani Goodyear Ka'opua, said to me recently, there will never be a world without her, as long as we read and wrestle with her ideas. In her poem, Kumu Trask told us where she is going. Into the Va'a of Kanaloa, voyaging Moana Nui, into our sovereign sons, drunk on the mana of Hawaii.
We are not American! We are not American! We are not American! We are not American! Say it in your heart. Say it when you sleep. We are not American. We will die as Hawaiians. We will never be Americans. The Americans, my people, are our enemies, and you must understand that. They are our enemies. They took our land. They imprisoned our queen. They banned our language. They forcibly made us a colony of the United States. America always says they are democratic. Lies! That is a lie! They have never been democratic with Native people. They have never been democratic with Indians. They have never been democratic with Hawaiians. The United States of America is the most powerful imperialist country in the world. In the world. They control the United Nations. They control the Pacific Ocean. All these nuclear submarines America is a death country. It gives death to Native people. And the only way to fight the United States of America is to be political. Coup-eh! 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 Coup-eh!
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yes. Well, I just would like to comment that it's very telling that the first thing you open the show with is a statement about Hawaiians would benefit from one less haole in Hawaii. That is what haoles always pick on. They never want to talk about the history. Listen, this is my opportunity to speak, and now I'm going to speak. They never want to include the history. And as you know, because you have the article with you, that statement is made at the end of my argument. The argument is preceded by a defense of the word haole, which we need to start with Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, who is a 32-year-old student, or was, is haole. He wrote into Kaleo, the student newspaper, saying he didn't like the word. He thought that the use of the word was haole bashing. That was part of his argument. My reply to him was a defense in the very first paragraph of that word. Why did I defend that word? Because the Hawaiian language was officially banned by an all-haole government, Bob, in 1900.
I'm
That's very
I'm
important.
not disputing those historical
Let me
facts.
have my say.
Let me say, I didn't like his letter any better than I like yours.
Let me have my say. You've had a long time to interpret what I said. I want to say to the listening, viewing public, what is consistently left out of my analysis. That includes what you left out, what the philosophy department leaves out, what everybody else leaves out. And that is the history of white supremacy, not only in Hawaii, but in the United States. I mentioned in that same article that in the American Constitution, blacks were 3/5 of a person. That was also left out by yourself and by other people. I mentioned genocide and removal of American Indians. I mentioned the fact that Asians were beaten because they were called a yellow peril, and that Japanese were interned during the Second World War, and that Native Hawaiians were dispossessed and their lawful government overthrown. Now, to leave all of those things out, and there are many other things that I haven't even mentioned about the contemporary status of Native Hawaiians, is really to inflame the response of the listening public who says, well, wait a minute, why did she say that? And my response is, I am saying that not only because it is historically and factually correct. Hawaiians would certainly benefit from less haoles in Hawaii. Many, not just one, but thousands, as Tahitians would benefit from less French, if it can't be no French, as the Maoris would benefit from no Pākehās, as American Indians would benefit from no white Americans, because those people are settlers in native lands, and they are living on stolen land. Now, my advice to Mr. Carter was, you had better learn where you are, which is the same advice I give to the philosophy department, which is in Hawaii. You are not in some white place, otherwise known as Europe. You're in a native place, and you are living on stolen land. So you have an obligation, number one, to understand the history of that place, which Mr. Carter does not want to understand, which Mr. Loudon of the philosophy department does not want to understand. And number two, you owe us something. Now, the question is, what do people owe us? Haoles owe us getting rid of their ignorance. They are so ignorant about Hawaii. They think they can fly here and say, oh, well, we're a numerical minority. We're unhappy here. Well, what I say to them is, learn where you are. You are not just off the coast of Southern California. You are in Polynesia, a stolen colony. That's what we are. We are a stolen colony. The United States has colonies. We are colonized people. Number two, learn the history. That's what I was trying to say to Joey Carter. Learn the history of white supremacy. Now, what does white supremacy consist of? Well, Mr. Carter didn't know this. Our language was officially banned. All Hawaiian language schools were closed. Who is Mr. Carter or any other white person to tell a Hawaiian we cannot use the word haole? That is our word. Now, white people don't like that because they're used to being the people who name other people. And so they come here and they think that that word is a bad word. They think it's pejorative. It's not pejorative. It's descriptive. Just like the name we have for Hawaiians is Nau'iwi in Hawaiian. We are the native people.
So maybe you can just give us a background on EJ, as it's called, or environmental justice, and why its frameworks were insufficient for indigenous rights.
Yeah, so that goes back to, if you look at the history of the thing that we call environmental justice, which is when we talk about that as sort of a broad umbrella term, it really refers to the history of activism. It refers to theory in the academic sense. It's and law and policy. So it's like sort of like this big term to describe a bunch of different things, and of course it begins through the activism of in the early 1980s of Black communities down in the South who believed that they were being targeted for toxic waste dumps, and so through that activism to stop that, like that famous book Dumping in Dixie, to stop dumping in Dixie, it led to studies. So like the communities, those Black communities organized, it led to studies, and they came up with this. They suspected that it was racism that was at the center of all of it, and they called it environmental racism. So that's what they studied. They looked to see, if this is actually really a thing. And according to the studies that communities and then later the government did, it turned out that that was something that you could actually name this thing called environmental racism. And so this is, a very particular articulation or a manifestation of racism that happens through environmental processes, and so this literature starts emerging, and it becomes a field of study, and it becomes law, right? Law and policy. In 1992, you see the Clinton administration officially adopting. He passes an executive order defining environmental justice, and what environmental justice should be, and so it enters the officially enters federal legislation and the legal lexicon and all of that stuff. And so, but it's based on this concept called environmental racism. Well, that's seeing in my argument is that looking at these processes of environmental injustices through the lens of race really is not enough to understand indigenous experiences of injustice. And as I argue in the book, so indigenizing it means that we have to be able to understand these broader histories of genocide and land theft, because all of that for Native people were environmental injustices. All of that, when the process to separate Native people from the land is itself environmental injustice. And so the ways that federal law and policy look at environmental injustice through this very narrow lens of race is not enough to understand things like the doctrine of discovery and forced assimilation. And so this is the stuff I'm looking at more and more. I think like when we talk about in the US racism and it being sort of the irreducible injustice, or sort of like the original sin of the United States, I disagree with that. And I think for Native people, it's so much deeper and so much broader that we have to have an analysis that is beyond this racial. It goes beyond the racial binaries and that racial lens. And so I think understanding environmental justice through this is one way to do it, but we have to do more.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. So when some comrades and I were reading this book and discussing this book, we ended up talking a lot about how solidarity between Black and Indigenous liberation struggles have been rooted in environmental justice issues, but more specifically, our relationship to the land and our historical relationship to the land, which I think, when we reduce things to race, that conversation just kind of gets lost, and really talking and naming environmental colonization gets lost. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that, because, we see this environmental colonization continuing to happen, right? Like in New Mexico here. I mean, New Mexico might as well be one big sacrifice zone. That's how it's treated and continues to be treated. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, where I'm going with it, like, so there's your question was kind of multi-layered, I think. The environmental colonization, I think, is the ways that we are speaking about it specifically with relation to native populations. Like, it's, we have to be able to cast this larger net when we talk about it. But again, going back to that question about what race has, like, what does a racial lens have to do with it? How does that serve us, or how does it fall short? And also, where does the coalition building break down between Native populations and Black populations? And that's something I'm looking at in my next book. How can we bridge those gaps and become better allies to each other? How can we enroll the support of Black activists in working to help dismantle settler colonialism? Right. So that means going beyond that racial analysis. But so for me, it's so this book that I'm working on right now, again, came from, as an idea from my publisher. They were like, what does white privilege look like when through the lens of settler colonialism? And I talked about it a little bit in the book, in the environmental book, by using the term settler privilege. And I just used the term, and I didn't build out a definition of it. But in this next book, that's what I'm doing. And I didn't even invent that. I'm going to say that right off the bat. That's not my creation. I actually came across a study by a woman who's now a friend of mine, who identifies herself as a white settler, and she is part of that hippie commune called Black Bear Ranch that I wrote about in As Long as Grass Grows, which is this Northern California hippie commune that is struggling with this. They're actually looking at how to decolonize their land, because they were, founded on this very problematic moniker called "A Free Land for a Free People." Like that's their moniker, like their motto. And so they started to look at it. Well, what does that really mean? 50 years later, they started talking about this.
Sounds like Israel.
Right? Yeah. And so it became this conversation. This woman, Laura Hurwitz, was a grad student at Humboldt State writing a master's thesis on this thing. Like, she'd been a longtime resident of the ranch, and wrote about her experience wrestling with these very difficult questions about being settlers on stolen land, and yet at the same time having all these hippie values of freedom and whatever else. And so she wrote about this, about settler privilege, and theorized it. And I was like, God, this is brilliant. And it was brilliant even more so because it came from her as somebody who's a white settler, like identifying that. So that's what I think. I think that's the big, we talk about justice in the United States, that and now, like the Black Lives Matter movement has really, with renewed, because of the George Floyd killing last year, and all, the uprising, or the renewed uprising. I don't know what else we could call it, because it's never gone away, but it sort of like sparked again in this very intense way. But it's now, I've been struck by the fact that in kind of the media spaces, there's this this idea or this term white privilege is really has gained a lot of currency, even in the mainstream, which kind of blows me away. And then Robin DiAngelo wrote that book, White Fragility, and so we have these terms that are sort of on the table now that aren't so. They're not pushed back. So, you have liberals are starting to use, white liberals are starting to use this language. But, oh God, I just totally lost my train of thought. So we can talk about, to some degree, we can talk about race and the fact that racism is still so very much foundational in the United States. But the elephant in the living room in the settler state is the fact of genocide and land theft. Like accountability, like there has not been any kind of process of settler accountability for the state that's built on profound disinformation about itself. And that's the conversation that I want to have. Like, how do we extend it take it beyond that racial analysis so that we can understand the settler state and bring an ethic of accountability in a much more, a much deeper, more meaningful, just way.
We were talking last night again, like about how that work isn't in contradiction to like the project of socialism and as it's being built in Bolivia. And can you explain like how it's been incorporated into the social movements as well as the state?
Yeah, that's interesting because we have those tendencies of ultra left and ultra indigenous that are denying European knowledge. It's not denial that will make us grow. It's just recognizing history. And I was making this reflection because if I wouldn't have gone through all of that process and learning medicine, because that same medicine gives me new tools to analyze, new tools to understand, and to promote respect for who I am as well. In that way, in that sense, talking about Che Guevara's fight for us is so necessary now to talk about his ideology, his thought, what he was promoting, anti-imperialism, because as we mentioned at the start of this conversation, they are still taking land and resources and people from the South. What we call migration is another kind of slavery that the world is seeing like nothing is happening, but it is happening. We are being treated like trash. People, millions eating trash. So when we talk about health, if we don't have food, we won't have any health. So if we don't go back to earth, no revolution will work. And my brother, he is also very reflective, and once he made that crisis also as well, and he decided to go back to the countryside, to our community, and since he's a sociologist, and we as family were getting back. Now he's a campesino leader, and from his reflection I learned he's right. If we don't produce our food, what revolution will work? So we have those academic debates, we have those so intellectual, so high elevated lectures, how reality should be, how it should be shaped, but with whom you are building that reality, which is your community, with whom you are building your proposals, because individualism is part of this sometimiento, of this oppressive system. Individualism is another weapon against humanity. Individualism that save whomever possible, sálvese quien pueda, and then you become dehumanized, cruel, to overcome, to go caminar encima de las cabezas, to go ahead, leaving behind, no matter mistreating or treating with cruelty to any other people. That individualism is part of the oppressive system in colonization. So even though we have those debates, which ideological tendencies, and even they are the people that are against progressive governments, they have allowed it because they are so pure and elevated in their leftist thought that what we are building is not valid for them. But we continue struggling, and who put dead people? Us. As campesinos, as indigenous, we continue, as you saw in the massacre that we suffered during the COP in 2019. That's why, how do we produce this knowledge? With whom we are building it? So it comes from community, and community takes care of we take care of ourselves all together. In Quechua, we call it Nogancheh Kancheh. We are together. It's not you over there, we over here. It's all together. Nosotros somos juntos. We are all together. And this we are all together means we work together, we take care of each other together. And the ceremonies for harvesting, for seeding are still community. I mean, communitary. Everything is shared, even today. And what we have shown during the first time of the pandemic, we were facing the COP, we were facing the pandemic, so people wouldn't have to eat. And our campesino leaders, our campesino community is so humble. They have many necessities. We don't have many rights until now, but from this, from their hearts, they gave as a gift, they sent for free tons of production for people that was facing hunger. Imagine how solidarity is still alive in community, because you can't be happy when someone is having this awful situation of we had cases that people committed suicide for hunger. We can't see that and see it like, oh, everything's fine, I'm in my bubble. No, because if we are community, we need to take care of each other. That's why we feel, even as people from the struggle community, I know it is painful and hurts, and sometimes we cry and we are angry because we feel. The moment we stop feeling, we must get preoccupied. Maybe we have become machines, automata, or so individualistic that we say, I don't care. The moment we don't feel that, I mean, we need to get back again our hearts, because that is what community shows you. We are together. That's why they shared food, they shared plants, medicine, herbal medicine, because there were people that wouldn't have anything. In this selva de cemento, jungle of concrete jungle, it is a desert jungle. It is a concrete desert. No, it's not a concrete jungle, it's a concrete desert, because you don't have plants to heal, you don't have food. During the strong times of the quarantines, people of the countryside, campesinos people, they had the way to go on, because they had the way to produce food and still feeding even other people in the cities. They wouldn't have a plant, a single bit. So imagine how capitalism made us believe that if we are locked inside a concrete desert, paying our expenses, receiving our money, we are just fine in this nice bubble. But then comes the pandemic and shows you you are just another one left behind if your money is not going to buy you health. Like that. So when we talk about Che Guevara's proposition, he was Dr. Ernesto Guevara first, and one of his proposals, the main ones, was la primera enfermedad para erradicar es la injusticia social. The first illness you must eradicate is social injustice. Otherwise, there won't be health for whom? Who will have health? The ones that have to pay for it, even the ones that had money, died here in Bolivia because they wouldn't have any other thing. The pandemic showed them that they are also fragile. They are also oppressed by this system, even if they think themselves as wealthy, because they are not wealthy. The wealthy ones are the 1% that are having in their hands the money of the 99%, which are all of us, even the ones hearing this. If you are not paying your bill to go tourism to Mars, you are not part of the 1%. And we need to remember this, because Tesla gave financed This cop against us, he financed the massacre of our brothers and sisters because they want this, destroy our land and then go to colonize another. How possible? Because he was the child of those diamond miners in Africa, so he had this education, the privilege of education of the greatest degrees, and now he's thinking about taking humanity to another step. He's taking humanity to our destruction. We need to think about this. Which technology are we planning to promote? Technology at the service of greedy corporations or technology at the service of humankind, of our survival? And you know, what corporations do is they say, oh, I worked a lot in the world, so I collect all this money and all of it in my hands. Corporations, it's my money, all of it in my hands. And the only thing they share is the pollution they leave for all of us. So all of us are paying the pollution corporations are leaving. That's why we are talking about climate justice, because it's not fair. Even they think themselves, oh, I'm so good people, I want to give to the global south a little cents so they can preserve this little space of Amazonia, but I will continue polluting. That's such a trap. That's why the thought of Che Guevara is so alive, because imperialism is continue sucking our blood, literally sucking the blood of our Mother Earth. That's why we need to address again that health is a human right, healthy food is a human right, and we need to go back to Mother Earth to preserve our lives.